Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to this Cerillion and Telecoms Tracker webinar on the subject of mobile private networks. It seems to be a real hot topic at the moment, and I think we've got a really interesting and engaging group of panelists assembled for this 45-minute discussion. My name is Dean Ramsay. I'm an analyst at Telecoms Tracker and your host and moderator for this afternoon's session. I have a background in OSS, BSS on that side of the telecoms industry. But one of the broader ongoing primary research activities that I'm involved in is in market sizing and trend analysis for various sectors within the industry. So today I'm going to present some of the data from that effort to kind of frame the conversation and give some context to the questions we'll be delving into with the panel. But before I go into the data and the background material, I'd like to get the panel to quickly introduce themselves and say hello. In an attempt to have a nice rounded discussion, the way we put this panel together today is we've got speakers from an operator, that's Darren Westmore at 3 Networks in the UK, and from a network equipment provider and software vendor, that's Peter Marshall from Ericsson, and from a BSS software vendor, that's Richard Doughty from Cerillion. So if I could get you to introduce yourselves and maybe say a little bit about either your involvement with private networks and give a little context to the audience, that would be great. If I could start with Darren.
Pleasure. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Darren Westmore. I'm the IT director for what is now referred to as 3 Private Networks. It's a useful name for this discussion, I guess. It's a good starting point. But previously we were UK Broadband Limited until we were acquired by 3 back in 2017, and then obviously folded into the 3 business. From a private networks perspective, UK Broadband has quite a active private network customer base with some interesting and quite big customers. Now, I know we're talking quite a lot today about 5G, but a lot of our customer base we've had for a number of years, and it's quite interesting in the fact that it's been there for a few years, and it's obviously on 4G. We are doing some 5G trials at the moment, which are all very interesting as well. But we've made money certainly from private networks, and I mean 2 of our customers that are worth just mentioning early on: Heathrow Airport and Port of Felixstowe, biggest container port in the UK. So that's my credentials for today. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Darren. Could we go to Peter next?
Global, looking at what's called the vision Ericsson. So what does the vision look like for 2030? But previous to that, I've been involved in 5G for the last 6 years now, since 2015. And in all those aspects, I've been looking at working with ecosystems, building with partnerships with the academia, startup communities, the government, and working across the whole kind of global landscape. So I've been involved in many, many countries in Europe and Latin America predominantly, but also Southeast Asia, and help create concepts, prototypes, consortia, and also be a big part of some of the private network rollout that we've had over the last 2 to 3 years as well. So it's very much in my blood, and I kind of live and breathe everything about 5G. So I'm very looking forward to having the questions about what can we do with 5G, what does it mean from a 5G point of view, and why will it make a difference? I think that's the important discussion. 5G is so different to 2G, 3G, and 4G. And therefore, that kind of awareness and that appreciation of what 5G can do compared with other technology is an important part of this webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. And can we go to Richard, please?
Thanks, Dean. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Doughty. I'm the Business Development Director at Cerillion. We're a BSS OSS vendor supporting multiple MNOs and VNOs, as well as fixed line operators for all over the world. And in the spirit of full disclosure, 3 Private Networks are one of our customers today. The focus, of course, today is on 5G and private networks, and what does that mean for a lot of us? And from the BSS vendor's perspective, it is very exciting. The previous rollout and introduction of new network technologies like 3G and 4G traditionally been, very much focused on the MNOs, who have been the enablers of this technology for customers. And for a BSS vendor, that often means no new customers. We're dealing with the same MNOs as we were before. But with 5G, we see a lot of opportunity in terms of new entrants to markets, technology that can enable new entrants either with dedicated infrastructure or within the infrastructure provided by the MNOs. So for us, it means not only a larger addressable market, but a lot more interesting things that we can do with our customers with that technology. Thanks, Dean.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, before we go into the slides, a quick note on the webinar platform we're using today. It won't, for whatever reason, let us show 4 videos at once. So you'll only ever see 3 of us speaking with the video feed at the same time. So if one of us disappears, it's just that's what's happening with the platform. It isn't one of us has disappeared. So we've opened up the chat facility so that the audience can ask questions too. So we'll get around to a Q&A in the last sort of 15 minutes of the conversation today. So while we're speaking, if you think of any questions, just type away in the comments section, and we'll pick those up at the end of the session. Another thing that we wanted to do today is add a couple of poll questions. So we thought it might be good to have some audience participation and opinion. This is just for the live audience. You won't see this in the playback version, but you'll see a poll appear today while we're speaking. So if you want to vote on that, and we'll take a look at it at the end. Okay, so I'll just share my screen, and we can move on to the slides. Okay. So, here we go. So our research has been able to find and track details of about 190 mobile private networks worldwide. Based on those conversations with operators, network equipment providers, software vendors, and enterprises, from each of those deployments, we've been able to establish some key details, such as who the main contractor is on the supply side, the size of the deployment, and in many cases, what kind of RAN technology is in use there. Now, the conversations on the supply side about how many mobile private networks there are kind of based around the ones that are publicly announced. So once we've extrapolated out to the ones that are kind of not visible to us, we kind of estimated that there are around 500 mobile private networks of any kind of reasonable size in the world at the moment. So we've taken some of that real world data from those conversations, and we've fed it into our data model. And it seems to be there's a reasonably strong spending growth that started in the sector, and it started to pick up around 2019. And that spending on mobile private networks is forecast to continue growing for the next 4 or 5 years. That's the point at which the validity of the forecast model runs out. I'm not saying that in 4 or 5 years the interest will drop away. It's just kind of I don't trust forecast models beyond that point. But that's where we are with the conversations that we're having. And so I think that maps quite well to the amount of hype that we're seeing around this subject in the industry at the moment. So it isn't a new line of business for suppliers. But it is becoming a solid growth market. And if we look at that from the point of view of a telco, any connectivity-based growth market is really worth some excitement and will create some hype. So now in that hype we see in the press and industry commentary, it's often the assumption that all mobile private networks are 5G, but we've seen that that's not really the case. There are still plenty of new LTE private networks being deployed. Now there may be cost factors governing that decision, or the enterprise may have been assured by the supplier that they can start on an LTE network, and then they can, they use tried and tested technology and may be able to evolve easily to a 5G RAN in the future as and when they need it. We saw some decisions around 4 or 5G being made depending on the deployment type of the private network. There currently appear to be 2 main types of network deployment model. a dedicated on-premise network for single-site enterprises, where most of the business activity is geographically limited to that place, such as an industrial unit or an airport or something of that nature. The other models are hybrid network deployment, where a mobile private network within a company site may then, if you take an example of, say, a logistics company, so there's some requirement to have connectivity within the site, but then when the trucks leave the site, they connect to an MNO's public cellular network. So in that instance, we saw enterprises choosing LTE as a preference in their private network, so that they can harmonize the handover to public mobile connections, using dual SIM devices or something like that. So 5G does seem to be driving growth in private networks, but it isn't the whole story for the time being. And it does seem to be driving the use of new technology, such as MEC and network slicing within these smaller network environments, which is really interesting for the industry to see. Kind of acts like a test bed for how they may be used in public networks in the future. So if, like me, you're used to talking about huge CSP macro networks and all the software ecosystems that go with that, this is something of a different world, really. And the radio access is often built around small cell configurations. So it's really interesting to hear from Darren and Peter about how this all fits together. One thing that became clear while we were collecting the data for this research is it's really difficult to do, to collect the data, because of the wide variety of deployment models that there are out there. So depending on they all depend on different business use cases, and there seems to be a massive variety of them. So we'll get into use cases in a moment, but I think it's important to note that what we're seeing here is some really good business diversification from operators and from NEPs. And that's kind of one of the central tenets of the digital transformation conversation that's been going on for the last decade or so, helping other industry verticals with their own digital transformation. So 5G has a big part to play in extending that effort for operators of the telecoms industry as a whole, beyond a connectivity play, being more than just a connectivity provider. So I think CSPs are starting to pay attention to the opportunity, but are not currently the default choice for enterprises looking to deploy mobile private networks. And from the 190 private networks deployments that we tracked, 57% of them were not, the main supplier of the infrastructure and the technology was either Ericsson or Nokia or Huawei, and to a lesser extent some of the other equipment providers. So CSPs were the second largest group, with 19% of the instances being CSP deployments. So there's nothing in the conversations that we had to suggest that mix is going to rapidly change anytime soon. So a breakdown of all this data will be available in a short white paper that will be provided after this session, but later in the week with all these data points there, so you don't have to screenshot this stuff. So if we have a look at some of the most prevalent use case scenarios, I'll just comment on a couple of these because I'm unaware of time. So airports and seaports. As Darren was pointing out, he's kind of the expert in this area, so it'd be interesting to hear some flavour based on the Heathrow and Heathrow deployment. But this use case, it's really interesting as a case study because these can be really huge sites, and they've got many thousands of connected devices. Some that stay on site, some that leave the site. There are all kinds of spectrum considerations, so as not to interfere with aviation comms. If the private network provides service to the airport's passengers, there's a whole other dimension there, different requirements. So it's a good place to look for emerging best practices and lessons in disciplines like configuration, for asset tracking, coordinating workflows in real time, doing things like wireless data upload of entertainment packages to planes, things like that. There's a whole raft of different things going on that are really interesting things to look at. Manufacturing and Industry 4.0 is an interesting one, and it seems very 5G focused as it relates to being able to provide network slices to mission critical functions, business critical functions within industry. So if we look at an example of a car manufacturing plant with robots on an assembly line, they can each have a network slice to ensure reliability and security, and provide clearly defined network characteristics for their specific needs based on that slice, and delivered by an SDN-enabled 5G core. So we often see these kind of typical use cases, and it's quite easy to be cynical about are there actually vast amounts of revenue there. Well, in preparation for this, I was reading a few articles, and I saw one where Vodafone had said that by the end of the decade, they expect to see 1 million private networks worldwide, and that's based on kind of research that they've done into how many factories there are, and how many warehouses there are, and how many facilities like that could use a private network. And the answer is millions. It's more than I would have expected. So there isn't, if it can be proven that private networks are a way to go for automation and all of those good things that manufacturing and industry is trying to do within its own digital transformation, then the play is really huge. The mass market opportunity is really huge. So if you look across on the right-hand side, there are some issues that I think have dogged MNOs, CSPs in the past, and as a private network supplier. And so let's just have a look at a couple of these. Public mobile network operation architectures have got little to offer. And the perception may be that those skills in a huge network actually play against an MNO. In a smaller scale, they're not specialist enough. So as a reaction to that, I think we're seeing CSPs putting together private network turnkey solutions, as Darren was talking about there. You see 3 private networks, and they're not alone. AT&T, China Mobile, Telefonica, Orange, Verizon, Vodafone, basically all of the world's largest tier 1s are breaking out a different business unit specifically for private network turnkey solutions. So it's certainly an opportunity that's suddenly coming alight, and is really taking, the operators are really taking notice of. I think businesses have got data security concerns still, and they often opt to store their data on premise. And I think in 2021, security is still a big deal. We see this all the time in services like SD-WAN, where enterprises have still got big problems with storing sensitive data with their service provider or in the cloud, which makes things unnecessarily complex from an operations point of view, but it is still one of the kind of like big concerns out there. So I think I'm becoming aware of time. It would be good if we could switch to some comment from the panel. I think if we could start with Richard from Cerillion, if you could give us some flavour on what you're seeing changing in the private network space, and how you think that's down to 5G.
You've touched on is the explosion of activity. As Darren was saying earlier, private networks have been around for a while, and 3 private networks certainly have made a great success of that. But what we're seeing from a BSS vendor's perspective is the additional capabilities required as 5G comes along and offers new capabilities within the network. So the ability to do things like dynamic spectrum allocation, better quality of service management, the ability to manage temporary devices on the network within the BSS. If you think of it within the context of some of the well-established use cases, let's take something like an airport or a container port, you've got multiple different end user types within that infrastructure, be that either a dedicated sort of installed network, or potentially something closer to a virtual private network as a service that an MNO can offer with spectrum allocation. And within that site, you've then got different user types. For example, you've got employees of that organization who will require service. You've got infrastructure within the site that might require IoT connected capability within the private network as well. You've then got corporate customers. So let's take the airport as an example. You've got recurring contracts with airlines and air crew who is providing repeat business and are on some kind of contracted arrangement with different levels of quality of service. And then, of course, you've got more transient end users. If we stick with the airport example, of passengers, transiting through the airport, requiring temporary access, potentially being pushed different services or promotions, but having their access, their speed, the quality of service maintained in a different way to that which is being offered to both the employees and the corporate customers. And of course, the abilities that 5G offer you to do that separation, to manage those devices in different ways, be they either handsets of customers making voice and data calls, or IoT devices in machinery, be they passengers, be they employees, be they corporate customers. The BSS can then manage those, price those, have a different billing relationship with each of those. But a lot of that's only enabled by that new 5G technology that's coming through.
So it sounds that as though it's a really complex kind of scenario and quite different to what we're used to in talking about larger public networks and those ecosystems that we're used to seeing in OSS, BSS types there. And it'd be good to hear from Peter about how he thinks what's kind of Ericsson's approach to this, because I guess you're a supplier direct to the enterprises, but you're also a RAN supplier to the operators. So you have lots of moving parts there. What's the kind of Ericsson?
So within our private networks, we have many collaborations around the world. We have over 200 at any one point where we're talking about what can we do with private networks and 5G or even 4G. And our main driver is the following: is that we need to work with them. We need to find the problem statement first. What does the manufacturer, the utilities, the public transport need to capture with the private network? And then identify how we can best manage that. And therefore, this is where it gets to the kind of very big difference between 5G and 4G. When you're looking at the 4G requirements, people say, well, we need to have this network. When can you make it happen? And from an Ericsson point of view, we can generally make it happen because we don't have that many dependencies from others. But from a 5G point of view, when we say we want to have this within a factory floor, Ericsson, when can you make it happen? This is where the whole ecosystem co-creation comes into its own. This is where we have to work with system integrators, content providers, device manufacturers to bring that to life. So we're in a very iterative approach to bringing these private networks into life, but we're also assure that we have to make sure that we have this end game goal, and then we kind of look at that end game goal and see how we can build on it. And the reason being is that the private networks are still evolving. We're kind of just moving into what's called the standalone experience, and the standalone experience then gives you that low latency, then gives you the network slicing that some of our operators and customers want. So there's not one simple answer to that question. It depends on the ecosystem. It depends on a whole load of co-creations. It depends on exactly what are the requirements within the factory floor, within the area where the private network will be.
Mm-hmm. So are you seeing, you mentioned network slicing there, are you seeing some of your customers actually starting to do that with it?
Absolutely. Yeah, network slicing is becoming an integral part of what we're looking into from a 5G point of view. And the reason being is that reliability and security are fundamental, and that's where the difference between 5G and Wi-Fi could be considered, with the licensed spectrum, and using that kind of network slice throughout the network provides that level of kind of confidence with a lot of our customers.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. When we talk about 5G network slicing in a public MNO network, I think it's often considered to be something that's on the 2-year horizon, 3-year horizon, with kind of standalone 5G and introducing 5G core into the core network. So, do you think it's kind of like in this way, Ericsson are using private networks as a good test bed to figure out all of the complexities of that before standalone 5G comes to the larger public network?
Yes and no. Again, one thing we're learning with 5G, we have to be flexible. The private networks are very good for that kind of dedicated coverage within a building. The dedicated networks or the private networks are very good for all sorts of reasons, but the network slicing maybe just gives you that kind of first step towards what the factory wants or what the production plant wants. So it really depends on that requirement. Private networks are good, like I said, because there is a one-off solution that can be located in the building, but it could also be classified as a big investment for some of the operators. So the network slicing has to be considered as an option to fulfill those requirements. And the incorporation of edge computing as well could be a consideration as well.
Yeah, certainly we see the network slicing as a real monetization option and key differentiator, both within the dedicated private networks. Think about things like container ports or other heavy industry where they want to put IoT devices in machinery. These things are very large objects moving very fast and very accurately. When you're lifting a 100-ton container off a ship and you're putting it down centimeter perfect. So guaranteeing speeds and latency and so putting that within its own slice is very important, and people will pay for that. But there's another business case as well, which we're seeing with some of these sort of emergency services networks and public bodies, where traditionally they've rolled out their own dedicated network, 2G, 3G. But of course, that's very costly. So whilst it might be okay for public sector to do dedicated network in major conurbations, less and less they're wanting to roll that out to more rural areas. There they can go to the MNOs who are doing that infrastructure and pay for guaranteed access. And maybe not just permanent guaranteed access, but access that they can increase and decrease as required. If there's a major incident, at a remote location, and for a temporary period, they need increased bandwidth because they've got to put multiple emergency services onto site, people will pay for that. So there's lots of examples, both in dedicated sort of on-premise private networks and as that virtual private network model.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what Darren thought. I know that you said at the top that Heathrow and Felixstowe is kind of LTE at the moment. What's the kind of plan to move forward? I imagine there are some situations where network slicing will become relevant to those situations.
Yeah, possibly. So I think I agree that this is an evolving area, definitely. But we've had a private network in place, for example, with Heathrow since 2015. So it's been there for quite some time. As you say, it's LTE and it's 4G. And in that particular use case, the 4G network is used to control all of the moving parts on the apron of the airport. So fuel trucks, baggage trucks, the shunting machines that push the aircraft backwards in the event of poor weather, snow plows, and actually that's how we got the contracts in the first place. So the interesting use case there that I'll just touch on for a second was quite some time ago. Before we got our contracts in 2015, Heathrow and London had absolutely bad weather. It was snowing, as indeed sometimes it does in the UK, and of course that grinds everything to a halt. and the airport grounds are halt, but not because it didn't have enough snow plows or didn't. It was that it couldn't contact the drivers because they all had mobile phones, and the mobile phone frequencies were completely inundated with people saying my flight's been cancelled. So off the back of that, it's a dedicated private network at Heathrow, and obviously on separate spectrum. So quite a different model. But I think the use case is interesting. And if you think about that and think, well, if that was to be upgraded to 5G, what else could they do? And with that dedicated model on 5G, potentially it's a whole load of bandwidth that they didn't have before. What could they use it for? And they could potentially set up, use it to back off maybe customer Wi-Fi capability or some other networking function that they need a higher bandwidth application for. So I think that's quite interesting. For Felixstowe, actually, it's an interesting use case again, I think, because we are trialing 5G up there, and the plan for Felixstowe, well, actually, the network first of all looks after the dockside cranes, and until you actually stand in front of one of these things, you really don't realise quite how enormous these things are. You know, they lift off of containers and they bring it onto the port side, and they shift up and down the dock as well. Previously, Felixstowe used, I think it was somewhere in the region of 240 Wi-Fi access points, and we replaced that with 3 cell sites. So points of maintenance, much lower, points of resilience as well, much lower. So overall, there was an increased or a much lower operational cost and service model because of the fact that there were fewer points of contact. But talking about 5G, at the moment the cranes are manned, and they have been forever and a day. But the idea that's being tried out at the moment is the idea of unmanned cranes. And in order to be able to run these things in an unmanned way, they need something in the order of 36 cameras, and then there's sensors and all sorts of other things that need to go along with running these things in an unmanned way. And I think that's where potentially 5G could change the landscape slightly for Port Felixstowe. Now, is that the right thing to do? Does it mean that they can go that they can operate longer? They don't have to do sort of crane driver shift changes. It's the business case for it is a little out there at the moment, but that's the model that we're driving towards. I think it's a really interesting idea. And the owner of Port Felixstowe has another 36 ports around the world. So doing a good job on 5G with Felixstowe. The first question that we're asking for this debate is it a gold mine? Or potentially that could be.
So it sounds like there's quite a crossover with what people. I know that the term IoT is not a particularly helpful term. It's it can mean anything really. But it sounds like there's lots of crossover there because of the many different connectivity issues and kind of scenarios that you've got within a port or an airport. It sounds like lots of that stuff could be classified as IoT. So within is the Sri private networks business unit kind of also the IoT business unit? Is it the same teams within Sri that deal with those?
Yeah, I guess you could call it that. I mean, under the heading of enterprise sales, private networks is one of the products, IoT is another product. Sometimes they overlap. So there is some synergy there.
I think it's interesting to see what kind of that relationship is, because I know that when operators started approaching IoT a few years ago, it seemed that some success was had by splitting out kind of a separate business unit approach to IoT, and so I think that's something we're seeing with like private networks now, and there's still sort of a very fuzzy idea about what it is we're talking about when we're talking about IoT and 5G and private or public, and so I think that if we can see these kind of success stories like Heathrow and Felixstowe, that it kind of brings a little solidity to what the opportunity actually is and what an operator can do in these kind of different environments other than consumer handsets and that kind of like mass market opportunity.
And Dean, that sort of touched on one of the questions that I saw come up in the chat, which is about the size of the user base within a private network? I think the question was tens or hundreds of devices. And it's not. I don't think it's that small by any means. Of course, we're talking corporate and B2B, and that's always a different proposition to mass market consumer. But you're talking sort of thousands or tens of thousands of devices at the very least, but also, as Darren's been describing, different types of devices as well. Sort of the more typical devices being used by humans, as well as devices which are embedded in kit, being used for automated unmanned operation. But of course, these things are aimed at a corporate customer base. They do bring with them, they attract larger revenues. So it's certainly our experience that the business case washes its face in that sense. There's certainly margin to be made there.
Yeah, I think the question was, most private networks have only tens or hundreds of end devices. How does that change the BSS or revenue model? I'd be interested to get Peter's opinion. I think from what I was mentioning earlier about the announcement that Vodafone, I mean, it's quite a bullish prediction, millions of potential private networks by the end of the decade. But I think what they're talking about there is kind of like smaller instances, but down, not airports. There are not millions of airports, but smaller business private networks that once we got beyond this point where private networks as a concept takes off as a telco or a Ericsson service, that the uptake will be much bigger in a mass market opportunity. What do you think about that, Peter?
Done some work on how much revenue will 5G provide, regardless of the base. And we reckon by 2030 there will be an additional $600 billion that will be created as a result of 5G technology towards all the 10 different segments that we're looking into. And the reason why that's important to raise is that each segment will provide different levels of benefit. And the kind of three that are really standing out at the moment is manufacturing, utilities, and healthcare. And those first two would really benefit from the private network side. So when we're looking at the business revenue, there's a real sense that, yes, there's a huge amount of potential in there. There's a huge level of interest in there. And even from the kind of very beginnings of 5G, that kind of benchmark document has caused a huge amount of discussion and interest. Well, how do we make that happen? And what's needed to make that happen? And the private networks is a fundamental part of that. But the second question is, well, that level of investment, well, how can we reuse that level of investment? How can we reuse that platform to do other things? So this is where you need to kind of look at that broader perspective and say, well, what else can we do with that infrastructure? So when you're looking at the 5G roadmap, you can look at the sensors, you can look at the surveillance, you can look at the automated robots and the kind of aspect. But that full life cycle, that full connection of all those devices working collectively together with artificial intelligence is becoming a very interesting point for a lot of these companies, and realizing, well, actually that $600 billion could be very attractive purely because of what it can achieve and all the variables, but also because of the level of automation that's going to be possible with 5G as well. So there's a whole host of interest from a private network point of view and a revenue point of view, but also how that evolution extends to fully automated systems going forward. So when you talked about the port, there's a view that within a couple of years, a lot of ports could be automated, and that level of safety could be improved significantly because of that automation. And we're working with Livorno, one of the big ports in Italy, about exactly that point. And 5G in the network within the Livorno port has been really introduced, not because of the kind of productivity aspect, but more from a safety point of view. And when we're talking about the cranes that was just mentioned previously, there's a real sense of, well, what else can you do with that low latency critical communication from a cranes perspective? So a lot of interest from a revenue point of view, a lot of interest about what's possible and building on that, but also that level of automation to help with quality and productivity.
Mm-hmm. So I think what I was ready to say when I first started looking into this is a slightly provocative question: is it a revenue goldmine? I was ready to say, well, maybe not, but what is happening is that it is driving 5G, advancements in how we present 5G, and therefore will further down the line be able to help us to, as industry, to address much larger revenues kind of by diversifying business.
Yeah.
But I guess what you're saying is in the short term, you know, in sort of like this year, next year, maybe it isn't like a huge revenue opportunity, but on a slightly longer horizon, it is.
But absolutely, and I think the situation is, and I guess it's a very good timing, coincidentally, I have to say, that as of today, we've produced a report from Ericsson which says what are the 5 big lessons learned of 5G over the last 22 months. And the one that I kind of stands out for me, there's a bit of kind of prototype and concept fatigue. We've done all these kind of robotics, done the kind of automated driving, done the kind of virtual reality. What's needed now to bring 5G into its own is to industrialize a lot of these concepts and prototypes, and this is where the private networks could become an important factor of that, having that contained, localized system to make some of these solutions become a reality. Out of all the use cases that are in this report, probably only a third of them are actually industrialized, so that's 66% of new opportunities that could be realized in private networks and become a part of an industrialized volumetric solution. And because they're not volume and because they're not scale, there's still that hesitance to say, well, why do I want to be a part of 5G? Because it's really quite difficult. We have to create the concept, we have to create the prototype, we have to create the ecosystem, and then we have to introduce it. Why can't we use that kind of broader ecosystem collaboration and accelerate that level of industrialization into these marketplaces? Because that's what's been required based on this report.
I did manage to skim through that report this morning, and I saw that there's a kind of comment on the consumer side of 5G about the amount of devices, the lack of devices, and or the consumer perception of whether people are using 5G or not. And there was like a huge band of people who thought that they were using 5G services.
Yeah, but the one. Yeah. I mean, that's another aspect as well. When we're looking at the industrial take-up, one thing we are thinking very strongly now is that the consumers are going to drive that market hard, because if the consumers are showing that they want the intention towards augmented reality, virtual reality, if they are confident about automated solutions, then that will drive the push towards the industry segments as well. So it's going to be a little bit of a case of early adoption on both sides of business and for consumers to make 5G successful.
I think you may well see with consumers that they may well slip into it in a way they didn't expect. So whilst it might not be the handset which they know and love and they think of when they think of telecoms, that's their main pull into 5G and private networks, it will be things, for example, I know we're not there yet, but automated vehicles which are on a road. All the traffic on that road operates within a private network to guarantee connectivity and latency so that vehicles communicate with each other. So the car comes with a SIM, which is designed to operate within a private network, and maybe a private network per motorway or per piece of infrastructure. And so they're adopting 5G as they're sort of using it in other parts of their life, not so much for making phone calls or looking at Facebook, but for those other areas of their life which are really benefiting from it.
And there's a really nice one, actually. The National Gallery and some other kind of museums around London are looking at creating dedicated systems to help with augmented experiences within their buildings, and also to provide an equivalent remote experience as well. So if you go into the National Gallery, you can see things which you normally wouldn't see because of this augmented dimension, and that's only been possible through this dedicated system. So potentially, if the dedicated systems work in locations like the museums, then it should be kind of give confidence to the industries. Well, if we can do that in the National Gallery, why can't we do it in the Ford factory?
And educational institutions as well,
exactly.
Being able to run a virtual private network for universities or schools, and indeed then link remote universities together on a private network, which would be in fact a lovely echo of the starts of the internet with Janet, which is sort of the network.
There's a really fascinating article that came out from a large consultancy company, I can't remember the name, but actually said that virtual reality can accelerate learning to a level that's never been expected. they were saying that 20 minutes of virtual reality training is equivalent to 3 hours face-to-face workshop.
Jack me in, Peter. I'm ready and willing.
Oh, you know, it's incredible. Can you imagine 20 minutes rather than 3 hours? I would sign up for that, no problem.
Okay, great. So, I mean, it's a really interesting topic, and I think to kind of bring it back around to where we started with our question about is a kind of revenue goldmine. I think that probably what we're saying here that yes, it is, and kind of, but we're in a position where that's kind of like a nascent market, and there's all kinds of moving parts going on, and the efforts seem to be kind of aligned from Ericsson and Three and that as an ecosystem, and that there's less of a kind of Wild West feel to private networks than there is with some of the technology cycles. It's kind of, I would say that to address our question, I think that yes, there is a lot of revenue in it, and it's also kind of something that's catalyzing technology and how we use it as an industry. Mm-hmm. So we're coming to the end of our time, but thank you everyone, and thank you everyone who's attended the webinar. I think if you registered on the Cerillion or Telecoms Tracker website, you'll be sent a short white paper this week, which kind of sums up all the data that we used and a little bit more breakdown of that data and a few of the key points that we discussed today. And I think if you're watching this on playback and you didn't register for the webinar, you can get that white paper probably on the Cerillion website. So with that, I'll wrap up, and if you want to say goodbye, guys, and we'll close it on.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.